Welcome back, my fellow patriots, to the Save Our Republic video series. You remember I used to say daily, but we know now that I'm doing it periodically depending on certain circumstances and key dates, etc. And today, April 19th, is a key date in American and world history. It is marking the anniversary of the shot heard round the world. It happened on April 19th, 1775. There's a lot of debate nowadays about when America was born. Some people think it was 1619. I think that's bunk. Other people argue it was when Plymouth happened or the Mayflower Compact. And other people think it's the July 4th, Independence Day of 1776. Some people say, no, it was 2 days before that when the resolution approving independence was approved. That's what John Adams would say. I think there's a good argument that it was actually April 19th of 1775. I'm not going to weigh in completely, but I'll think you'll understand why in just a second. For well over a decade, the British Empire had engaged in a wide-ranging campaign to crush colonial liberties in America. Contrary to popular modern belief, this was much deeper than taxation without representation. King George III and a compliant parliament had declared that the empire was supreme in all cases whatsoever. The colonials must submit to the empire's dictates even if they were not represented in parliament, and the colonials possessed no unalienable rights except at the pleasure of king and parliament. The empire went about proving its position in many ways. There would be 27 grievances of British oppression in the Declaration of Independence. And if you want to learn more about those, you should visit and listen to the podcast of Patriot Lessons, American History and Civics podcast, where we're going through each grievance. You can also check out my book, America's Survival Guide, about how to stop America's impending suicide, because many of the grievances are addressed there. Colonial resistance was widespread and stiff. The colonists repeatedly petitioned for relief, and they were repeatedly dismissively ignored. The king decided a military solution was in order to squash colonial resistance. The perceived epicenter of the problems, Boston, was occupied by redcoats, and England's political and military leadership were certain that a quick blow in Massachusetts would break the Americans and end any pretense of rebellion. England sent orders to the Boston troops to go on the offensive and secretly arrest colonial political leaders and capture military supplies. The British commander in Boston determined to arrest Samuel Adams, a leading son of liberty and a major agitator for American resistance, and John Hancock, a rich merchant and leading political leader who now is very famous for his signature on the Declaration of Independence. In April 1776, the two men were ensconced in a small village of Lexington, about 7 miles away from Boston. The British also targeted an arms cache in Concord, about 20 miles outside of Boston. The plan of action was simple. March at least 850 redcoats to Concord, arrest Adams and Hancock, then proceed another 13 miles to Concord. March at least 850 redcoats to Lexington, arrest Adams and Hancock, then proceed another 13 miles to Concord, destroy or capture the military supplies, and then return to Boston. The British maneuvers began late on the night of April 18th. They were brought by ships from Boston to a landing point where they would begin their march inland. Colonials quickly moved to alert the countryside. Son of Liberty, Dr. Joseph Warren, who I'm an indirect descendant of, sent riders Paul Revere and William Dawes to warn Lexington and Concord, and on the way, to tell all they passed that the British were coming. At Revere's instructions, 2 lanterns were hung on the steeple of the North Church, warning that the British were coming by sea. Revere and Dawes traversed different routes, made it to Lexington, and warned Hancock and Adams. On the way to Lexington, Revere was detained by British troops, and they threatened to blow his brains out. But he was eventually abandoned. Meanwhile, dawn broke. In Concord, in Lexington, no more than 70 determined but hopelessly outnumbered colonial militia faced down the British troops. Who fired the first shot on the village green is lost to history, but it was a slaughter. Several colonists were killed on the spot. Only one British soldier sustained a small injury. Adams and Hancock eluded capture. The British soon departed for Concord, where they burned a meeting house and a few supplies. Hundreds of colonial militia confronted the British. A skirmish broke out, killing several on each side. Sensing serious jeopardy, the British started their 20-mile march back to Boston. The Americans made them pay. The British were almost continuously harassed by gunfire by colonials who hid in the woods, behind walls, and in homes. The march was a living hell. Desperate British stormed some of the homes and committed atrocities of the highest order. At the end of the day, 9 Americans lay dead, 39 wounded, and 5 missing. The British suffer 73 deaths, 174 injured, and 26 missing. This disaster was far from the decisive victory the British arrogantly expected. The Americans had proven their resolve to live free or die. We, as their heirs to this brilliant legacy, should determine to keep alive that spirit in our hearts and minds. If you really want to learn more about Lexington and Concord, you should listen to the Patriot Lessons American History and Civics podcast, available on Google Play, Apple Podcast, and all major podcast platforms, Spotify, etc., because we have an episode dedicated to Lexington and Concord, and it's much more thorough than I could do in this quick Save Our Republic video. Don't forget about America's Survival Guide at americasurvivalguide.com and Patriot Week at patriotweek.org. Until next time, God bless you, and God bless America.